Principles and Practices. I'm your session moderator, Jara Lee, Program Director at ICOR, and our presenter today is ICOR President Linda Nelson. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Linda.
Okay, thank you. We're happy that you could all be here today. We know that people's schedules are not as usual, or sometimes they are more usual, but everybody's doing things a little bit differently today. We have three potential webinar objectives. One is understand how effectively managing risk is essential to your organization's resilience. The second one is how to identify different sources of risk. And the third objective is how to analyze and quantify risks. The recording of the webinar will be available on our ICOR webinar page. Today is Wednesday, probably by Friday. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please use the questions button. I see some people are already using it. Questions will either be answered during the webinar, usually during a poll or something, or if we don't get to them, in an email after the webinar so that we'll do a reply all if we're not able to get to everyone's questions. I always like to start with a definition, just so we're all on the same page. Although I really hate the definition for risk, but this is what it is. There's been a lot of debate in the international world about a good definition, so they've kept it very short, which is the effect of uncertainty on your objectives. They don't even have the word "your" in there, but I'm just throwing it in there to make it make more sense. This comes from ISO 31000. Secondly, they talk about that uncertainty is usually some kind of a negative incident or event that could be a threat to your organization. But on the positive side, they could be opportunities. So I'm just going to throw out here that if you're a business continuity person or a risk manager of some kind, that there's some positives to this pandemic, which is you've got your organization's leadership attention, and perhaps you can now get some of the planning done that you've been wanting to do all along. So when we talk about the discipline of risk management, we're saying that managing risk is dynamic. It's a part of governance.
Linda, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry to break in, but we've had a couple people say they can't hear us. So, can't hear anything. A couple people. So maybe we can check our audio controls.
I don't know what to say. It says that we're connected.
I'm going to send some people can hear us. Okay, thank you for checking in, folks. Okay.
So maybe check your individual controls, like make sure that you don't have your audio muted on your individual computer. Sometimes is what happens. Okay. If you can continue to monitor that, but most people can hear us. I can't change anything because GoToWebinar says that we're being heard. So check your individual computers.
Yeah, and we are getting feedback from various people saying that they can hear. So, yeah.
Okay.
Just check your audio controls. Thank you.
So managing risk is both dynamic, and it should, of course, be part of governance and leadership, as well as it should help you set strategy for how your organization manages risk itself. So let's begin with our first poll. And one of our challenges, we like to use polls, but one of the challenges with polls is that you don't have a lot of choices in your answers. So generally speaking, at your organization, who's responsible for managing risk? So Jerry, you're sharing the poll results. It is sort of interesting. I guess one of the options we could have put in there was everyone. And I would like to say that everyone in the organization should have some responsibility for managing risk. Obviously, your risk management personnel are responsible for owning it in some manner. But different parts of your organization should have different responsibilities for managing risk. So I'm glad to see these are pretty evenly distributed with, of course, risk management people having the most. But thank you, Jara. So there are different standards for risk management. If you're looking at project risk, Project Management Institute has a lot of stuff on project risk. In the United States, the National Institute for Standards and Technology actually has a guide on how to conduct risk assessments. The focus is on information security systems, but the methodology works anywhere. And then the most common, in fact, the most purchased guidance document by ISO is ISO 31000, the Risk Management Principles and Guidelines. That was updated recently, and there's other parts in that series that talk about specific type of risk. But also understand that every management system standard, whether it's quality or environmental health and safety or business continuity, they all manage a specific type of risk. ISO 31000 talks about some principles for risk management, including, of course, it creates and protects value. It's part of decision making. It should be systematic and structured. It is the responsibility of management. Like we said in the definition, it's supposed to address uncertainty. And it's based on the best available information. And here is the key piece that I want you to keep in mind as we go through this. We're always learning. And so how we managed risk in January or December of 2019 looks different than how we're managing risk today. So it's based on the best available information. It should also be tailored to the needs of the organization, and this is another example why managing risk, it isn't just a template that's something you throw in, because it has to be tied to how the organization operates and all of its different interested parties. But it should be transparent and inclusive, meaning that we're talking about it should be the responsibility of everyone in the organization. It also is oftentimes tied to human or cultural factors on how it's actually done. It should be responsive to change. So we've seen a lot of change. So how you're managing risk, like I said today, might look different than in the past. And it is supposed to help you function better as an organization and be part of continual improvement. I wanted to talk for a minute about what it looked like before and what we're talking about here. So the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, back in 2017, published a paper on the risk of local outbreaks becoming global pandemics, and they listed some reasons for this. One is that we've got a risk of infectious pathogens, quote, spilling over from animals to humans. That there's, of course, been this development of antimicrobial resistance, or some words we don't say very often. This idea that antibiotics aren't as effective because we're using so much in our soaps and we're just not exposed to as much disease as we had been before, so we don't have any resistance. We are definitely seeing the spread of infectious diseases through global travel and trade. There also is a new risk of bioterrorism. Actually, it's not really new. It's probably a 70-year-old risk. And what we're really experiencing specifically in the United States is weak public health infrastructures. And we also see it, of course, in a lot of developing countries as well that are in much worse shape than the U.S. The reason we use the U.S. as an example is just because you would think as a rich country we would have a very strong healthcare system. But this was back in the winter of 2017. WHO, they published in May of 2017, and you might want to take a look at this. As I said, the slides will be available afterwards, so you can get these links. But if you just actually Google WHO Influenza Risk Management, they have it in several different languages, and they just talk about how you can manage risk of a pandemic. And they look at things like how prepared are your capacities for emergency risk management, and based upon what could happen, these become your planning assumptions. And as part of your response, it's supposed to be proportional to the identified risk and based on the current event. And again, we're tied back to that available capacities. And then your recovery aspect is supposed to be based upon, of course, what happens, and you're supposed to prioritize the areas of greatest need. Even as late as September of 2019, CNN published from another study that the risk of a global pandemic is growing and the world isn't ready. It's a quite interesting article if you look back on it. WHO also published that they said the world is not prepared. And I believe that the CNN news is actually from the WHO pandemic report or WHO pandemic report. But they said for too long, we've allowed the cycle of panic and neglect when it comes to pandemics. We ramp up efforts when there is a serious effort and then quickly forget about them when the threat subsides. It is well past time to act. And last month's webinar was about knowledge management, and we used some examples about how different organizations, including WHO, that are managing infectious diseases, how they are trying to manage the knowledge that they have learned so that it can be reused. And we see that some countries are doing that better than others. What they did is they put out a call in September of 2019 for world leaders to take 7 concrete actions to lessen the risk. And of those, they include monitoring progress during international summits, creating multi-year disaster plans, strengthening United Nations coordination, and building preparation systems across all of your sectors. Some of this seems like an duh, like why wouldn't our world leaders be doing this? But we can see that some have been more successful with this than others. So to that question, our next poll, I just wanted to get an idea of to what extent do you feel your national and local government was prepared to handle the COVID-19 pandemic, or how they're doing now as well. Jara, are you able? There you go.
Yep. And we had, I guess, a couple people had trouble connecting with the poll, so we'll try to leave it open a little bit longer this time.
Sure. One of the things that I just wanted to mention is that Jara and I are also working remotely. Usually we're sitting in the same office doing our webinars, which allows us to coordinate a little bit better. And I am on a slower internet than she is, and that probably most of you are. I'm using a satellite internet, and we're having a thunderstorm today, which of course slows things down a bit. So I appreciate your patience if I'm speaking before the actual slide comes up. I'm trying to delay or actually move the slide ahead faster than I'm talking, but sometimes my mouth gets ahead of me.
Okay, so we've got 72% voted. We'll go ahead and close that and share.
All right, so only 2% of you say very prepared. And what I would like to do is, when this is over, I just kind of look at by country what that looked like, and if there's anything significant, we'll share it with you afterwards. But a third of you said that you're not prepared at all, and 52%, more than half of you think that the countries were somewhat prepared. And so really between very prepared and adequately prepared, looks like we're at about 17% total for that. So thank you for sharing. I do love, this guy's just really handsome, but otherwise I do like this, do we have your attention now? It has been realized. So what are we supposed to do now? Because we know that, Benjamin Franklin said, by failing to prepare, you are also preparing to fail. This is an often quoted quote, and it really is time to understand best practice for managing risk. When we look at how to be more prepared, just in really plain English, there's some essential aspects. One, you should list individual risks. Just get a list of things that either have happened or could happen.
And Linda, yeah, we're having some weirdness with the poll. It's not going away, the results.
Oh. So you can't see my slides then?
Yeah, so let me see what I can do here.
That is weird. One of my guesses that what we're seeing with GoToWebinar is the same thing that we're seeing with Zoom and other tools, is that everybody's using them, and so the systems within that are being stretched as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So are you able to, Jara?
Yeah, it's not going away. I'm trying
the poll is not going away at all?
Yeah. Let me try sharing again and then hiding it again.
I don't think it'll I don't know if it'll let you share it again.
No.
Well, I'm going to continue just so we stay on schedule. And again, this is recording, so and you will see the slides again. So some individual aspects. Essentially, it's as simple as listing individual risks, and then you put a rating of each risk based on the likelihood and impact. And then you look at what current controls do we have in place and where are we vulnerable. So what are our strengths and weaknesses for managing risk? and then put together a plan of action to treat those risks. This is about as simple as we can make it for this. When we look at ISO 31000 and their risk management methodology, they start with the fact that you need to establish your context. So what are you doing a risk assessment around? In other words, what's your scope? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. As part of the risk assessment, you need to identify your risks. So what may happen and why? You need to analyze your risks. What are the impacts? You need to evaluate those, which looks at the probability or the likelihood. And then you need to put together some risk treatments, which is part of your risk strategy. So how to mitigate the impact or likelihood of the risk occurring. And finally, you need to monitor and review and communicate. So Jara, is the screen back up yet?
No, and I've lost all access to the poll now. So can you access it and see if it'll do anything for you?
All right, I'm not going to run any more polls, but it does say it's closed. So you guys can't see my screen at all, huh?
No. All we see is a quick poll on.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
So the audience view, I can see what the audience view is. Okay. So you've tried to share and unshare?
Yep, I'm gonna.
And I'm controlling. I'm hitting it now, so I'm gonna hide it again. And I'm going to. Does say I'm showing. Are you able to see? You're still not able to
No,
see.
it's still.
That is
it's
really
still the
weird.
That is, yeah. I've never experienced this before.
No, I have not either.
And I'm doing some troubleshooting as we speak.
So let me stop sharing my screen and then restarting it again. See if that changes anything.
Okay.
There we go.
Yes.
So you can see my screen now?
Yeah.
All right. So the previous, let me just go back a couple then. So this was where we were talking about, you didn't get to see my handsome man, but anyways, the essential aspects: list the risks, rate them, assess your controls, and put a plan of action together. Then we talked about
Linda,
yes.
I am seeing something that says, "Thank you for joining. We'll begin this session shortly." But yet I still see everything here. So I've lost, like in the chat, I've lost anybody in chat.
Okay. Well, I can see everything. So we'll go along, and maybe what I can also do is re-record this so that we have it without all the other things
And
happening.
if folks can hear us, if you can type in the chat that you can hear us, and is everything okay? I wonder, I'm not getting, are you getting any chat responses?
Nope. 12, only seeing the poll slide, can't hear the audio.
Okay, so it could be on my end where it
says, yes, we're here, we can hear you. So I'm going to go ahead and continue.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
So you need to establish your context. You need to do the identification, the analysis, the evaluation, and your treatments. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about each one of those things. When we look at the scope, what is the scope of the risk assessment? Is it going to be based on the probability of a specific risk event, a specific risk category, or completely everything that you can think of, which is kind of the all hazards approach? This is an example of pandemic risk forecasting. I was watching 60 Minutes here in the U.S. They have 60 Minutes on Sunday nights, and they were talking about a computer algorithm with using artificial intelligence called BlueDot, where they were able to track where people went who were infected or who had left Wuhan and who could potentially be infected, and then they tied that to the outbreaks. And so it's really interesting if you wanted to watch that if you didn't see it. But this is an example of the fact that countries, nations, really need to be doing pandemic risk forecasting. I wouldn't think this would be something that companies would need to be doing, but the fact is that there was a hospital in Toronto. There was no one in the United States using this tool, but there was a hospital in Toronto that was part of this system. They purchased this product. I'm not selling the product. I'm just saying there's things out there that you can use. And they used it as a national hospital system in order to start getting supplies before they knew that they might even be impacted. So this is something that's an example of specific risk identification and using a scope that's very narrow. However, and it's usually something that's going to be owned by your country or your larger community or your region. But when we're looking at different sources or types of risk, what you're trying to determine is what may happen and why. And strategic risk is something that your top management should be looking at. Who are our competitors? What are our risks to our actual company? Meaning that that we won't have adequate customers, that something will go wrong with our product, things like that. Then if you are a company that is dependent on regulation and you have a lot of compliance things, you would have a compliance risk area. The one that we're probably most familiar with here is operational risk, and that's where a lot of the business continuity types of things fall. Of course, every organization has somebody managing financial risk, and then there's reputational risk as well. These are considered, in general, the 5 sources that are most often accepted. There are other ones that are like subsets of finance, for example, and subsets of operational, but these are the big buckets. So the question now is, what risks do we have because we're in a pandemic? So the bigger question on strategy is, how will your organization generate revenue and execute operations with workplaces mostly either offline or remote? Understanding that some organizations are actually operating at more than 100% because of what they do. Hospitals, even some of the food productions. There's people that are in IT that are actually doing more than they normally do. But there is a disruption to the workplace due to social distancing. We do see plummeting employee activity and even deaths involved. So you need to be, the risk of the pandemic is real for your employees. You're seeing stressed supply chains. We're also seeing recession, unemployment, and investments being pulled back. If you don't even want to watch the investments anymore. We are seeing economic instability, and in the U.S., there's some cities that are experiencing civil unrest because people don't want to be sheltering. And then we're also saying, just think about how simple this disruption was in a webinar, based on the fact that GoToWebinar is probably having some challenges over lunchtime with a lot of people using it. But now we have cybersecurity risk. So everybody's working remotely. What has that done to your cybersecurity risk for your organization? How are you even backing up information if people aren't saving what's on their laptops to your VPN? So we're not going to answer this poll. I'm going to skip this, but I want you to think about the fact is how has who is managing risk for your organization changed now that we have a pandemic? My guess is that you would see that top management is way more involved. That this is now, top management is 100% managing risk, or maybe they were only on, I think we saw that they were like 30% as part of that earlier. I would be shocked if top management hasn't been involved in managing the pandemic risk for your organization. And so one of the things for you to consider is that depending on the incident, there's going to be different level of involvement for managing risk. I would also think that business continuity people have been very busy, especially back in March when we saw a lot of the changes occurring. When we look at different risk identification methodologies, that some of them can be very subjective and some of them are much more objective. But there's, the idea of brainstorming, looking at historical records of what's happened. The Delphi method is one where you get a group of experts in the room and they talk about things that they're supposed to have more knowledge than maybe the people that are part of your brainstorming. Also including, just like you might do in a business impact analysis, doing interviews and trying to not only looking at historical records, but what has been past experiences. People can use kind of the if-then flow charts. If this happens, then we're going to do this, or if this happens, this would be how it would impact us, which ties kind of to your, they have that like the bow tie analysis type of thing, which is the next one. What are our threats? What controls do we already have in place? And then what controls are we doing as part of our recovery to manage the impact? Audits are something that if organizations are doing regularly, one of the purposes for audits is to find out what's at risk and where are we vulnerable. And then a really simple one is just looking at different scenarios. What are we going to do for pandemics? What are we going to do, if we have a fire, or whatever the usual types of scenarios might be. In addition, there's a lot of different types of failure analysis. There's the fault tree analysis, where you talk about what the incident is, and then what are the things that could cause that. I'm sure you're familiar with the SWOT, which is used for a lot of different purposes. Your failure mode and effects analysis, you'd look at ranking your threats, looking at severity, how often they occur, and what your detective systems look like. And then the PESTLE ones, where you look at risks from the environmental, legal, technological, political, economic, and societal. I should have probably said those in the order to spell out PESTLE versus backwards, but I think you got that one. So we said the very first thing you should do is list potential risks. So once you've identified the scope, then you look at what are the simple things, what are the things that could potentially happen to us. And then some of the information that you need to collect would be the nature of the risk. So how, when, why, and where is the risk likely to occur? What's the source? So what aspects of the source put the element at risk? And what technical data might you have? When you're looking at the elements of the risk, who or what's at risk? Why are they vulnerable? What technical data or background information you have? And then, of course, looking at statistical or historical data. This is where your insurance part of your organization or who your insurance carrier can give you a lot of really good information. And then we talked about looking at your controls. So how are we currently controlling this risk? Are they adequate? What do we need to be doing? And so when you have some controls in place, and I'm sure there's controls in place that maybe have just been embedded in how you operate that you might not even be aware of, but also looking at, are they adequate? So for some organizations, the pandemic hasn't had a really bad impact on them because they've had they've already had a remote work capability in place. They've already had a way to meet online and have their meetings. That's how they function normally. One of my kids, there's been no change in her job because she's always worked from home. Two of my other kids, they have to be at work to do their jobs. And so one of them, their job isn't being done, and the other one is still being done with some protections. So when we're looking at the impact, you need to have some way of quantifying the impact. So you've identified these risks, and then you need to figure out how can they hurt us. And so one of the things that's recommended is that you just do a simple high, medium, and low, and we'll look at some ways that you can categorize those, but listing them in order from greatest to least, for example. And here is a way that you can do it. And so, here they're using a 1 to 5 scale, and 1 being extreme and 5 being negligible, and then they put in a description based on, number 1, it's threatening the survival of the organization. You've got some major problems with your stakeholders, and your revenue loss is greater than whatever. And an example would be a death or destruction or greater than a $500,000 loss. So these are just categories that can help people understand on the impacts on it and put some sort of objectives against those impacts. One of the questions we had from a participant prior to today, when part of the registration was, is it necessary to identify probability, or could we just focus on the identification of the impacts of every threat? So here is the biggest challenge, and I think this becomes a place where risk managers and business continuity managers kind of butt heads, because there are people in business continuity who don't think that we need to worry about the causes, we only need to worry about the impacts. And then there's people from the risk side that say it's all about the probability, and we need to manage the risk side of it. So my answer to this is really that you need to be doing it, because if you don't have a balance of likelihood or probability and the impact, you're only looking at it from one direction. So here is where you need to estimate the likelihood of the risk occurring. So here, and there's another example of A being very likely to E being rare, A being it's expected to occur, and E being may only occur in exceptional circumstances. When you're looking at your evaluation criteria, so if you have a level of risk that's high, it's again another way to put these in some kind of categories. means it's almost certain to threaten the organization. The financial threat of survival to the organization's body or stakeholders. It requires involvement of senior management, and you should try to eliminate all risk to that or stop doing whatever it is. Those are some of the directions that it was put together by this organization's criteria. When you're doing risk evaluation, you should compare the estimated risks against that risk criteria that we just looked at, and this helps you determine the significance of the risk. It also helps you to make decisions about the significance of the risk and whether each risk should be accepted or treated. And then you need to try to qualify or quantify those risks by probability and loss, which helps the organization to spend the resources on those, here we go to, most likely to occur, which ties us to putting together some kind of a chart. So you can see on the left, you've got increasing likelihood, and on the bottom, you've got increasing consequences or impacts. And then in the middle, of course, the increasing level of risk. So you need to put together some way of measuring both the likelihood and the impact and put them in sort of a risk metric. This is going to be part of your risk attitude or your risk appetite of the organization when you determine what it is, how you're going to treat that risk. So reminding you that you need to have two scores, one for likelihood and one for impact, and then you need to put together a scorecard. There are two ways to evaluate risks. They're quantitative and qualitative, and there's pros and cons to both of those. But the quantitative is really going to take more time. It's going to be more expensive, and you need to have more qualified people doing this. So this might be something that people in risk might be doing, your risk department. It might be done by your business continuity people, but it gives you a much more accurate image of the risk because it's more data-driven. However, we do need to balance that with some qualitative evaluations as well. This is something that can be done rather quickly, which is a positive. The negative part about it is it's not as accurate, and therefore the probabilities can be skewed. And it also makes it more difficult to do a cost-benefit analysis if you're not exactly sure that your data is as data-like as you'd like it to be. This is an example of a qualitative evaluation where they look at their likelihood from very unlikely to very likely and their impact using that low, medium, and high. So you've seen they call them heat charts or whatever you want to call them, but where they then identify this is based on injury to personnel. So they go from an incident but no injury all the way to a major impact, which is death or disability. The NIST, the National Institute for, I already forgot what the S stands for, Science and Technology. In the United States, they've suggested that you should add some quantitative measures to this, so that they essentially have used that heat chart and added some numbers to it. So high risk is equal to 1, where a low risk is equal to 1/10. And putting that, so a risk is high if it scores between 51 and 100, or your organization could say it has to be high if it's between 75 and 100. You can put whatever numerical values you want. I've also seen this done instead of a 3x3 chart, a 5x5 chart, and changing the numbers a bit. So it's really up to you how you want to do that. But most of this is going to be driven by your organization's risk appetite, which is that amount of risk your organization may or may not take. So the question becomes, are they risk averse, or are they ready to live on the edge and ready to try anything? And understanding that your risk appetite reflects the organization's risk management philosophy, and it's going to influence its culture and operating style. And it also guides resource allocation, and it's part of designing the infrastructure necessary to respond to and monitor risks. So if the organization is risk averse, they're going to have a very low risk appetite, meaning that they're going to try to control everything that they can and try to minimize any activity that might make them vulnerable. And this is or the opposite of that is, let's just go for it on all aspects. And so I want to mention here is that your organization might have many different risk appetites based on the activity that's being done by the different parts of the organization. So, for example, anything that involves security, safety, your technology, and anything that's regulated and financial aspects are probably going to be more risk averse or have a low risk appetite or tolerance. And things like R&D, marketing, sales might be much more less risky activities themselves, and therefore they might have a higher risk appetite. So this is going to tie into what activities your organization puts into place, or what controls your organization puts into place to protect those different activities as well. So we're not going to do this poll, but I wanted to have an understanding of your organization's risk appetite and say, has this changed as a result of the pandemic? And so I'm just going to philosophize here a little bit that you may have had some challenges getting the attention of management, especially business continuity people, who have been trying to plan for worst case scenario of a loss of personnel or loss of access to personnel, or loss of facility or loss of access to your facility, or impact to your supply chain. That what they've done is probably plan for those things that are more likely to happen, but that the organization wasn't willing to expend resources on worst case scenarios. And this is a daily challenge that business continuity people face all the time. It's the same thing with what you've seen is, as we've seen more information security and cybersecurity breaches, we've seen companies spending more money to control those things because they've had incidents that have hurt them and cost them money. Now that the pandemic has happened, I would expect that the organization's risk appetite for pandemics has changed as well, and that they're less likely to just say, well, we'll just let it run and see what happens. I don't even know if it's possible for organizations to ignore it and to do business as usual under these conditions, which really leads us to the question of, do we need to plan for everything? And back to the question that came from the participant, the webinar registrant who asked that question earlier, you often hear people talk about black swan events. These are high impact, low probability events, of which the coronavirus is one. Yes, we experience influenza problems every year. Yes, a lot of people die. The real challenge is that we weren't prepared as a country in the United States and in many countries to manage the number of people dying at the same time or needing health care at the same time, which is why we weren't prepared, because they weren't expecting this to happen, or they hadn't planned for it to happen. So the question goes back to, do you need to plan for everything? This is a question that I think you need to pose to your organization sometime soon and say, what's happening to our planning based on the fact that we've now had this pandemic? What are we going to need to change? And what can we learn and take advantage of from what we've been experiencing that we can now implement all the time and become embedded into what we're doing? Because when you're looking at options for risk treatment or how to mitigate, you're looking at your perceived vulnerability of the organization. And I would guess that most organizations, because most countries they might have felt that they were vulnerable, but they didn't feel like they needed to worry about it because it was a low probability event. And then everything is tied to the cost of measures compared to the benefits. So once organizations have a better idea of what this is costing them, they might now in the future be willing to spend more money to prevent it from happening again than they might have been 6 months ago. The urgency, I would say that we're in an urgent time. It's time to quit thinking about it and start doing some things. And then looking at some overall feasibility and suitability of the options. What is it we can realistically do? Because we also understand that companies potentially aren't making as much money as they were before, and their investments are down. So what is actually feasible? What can they spend to help them get through this time without going out of business with their spending, based on we're going to go out of business if we don't spend it, which all ties back to our risk appetite. There are 4 types of risk treatments or risk mitigation that's generally accepted. The first one is to accept. And so we're just going to keep playing at our own risk. You're going to avoid touching that because it has sharp objects, sharp edges, or we're going to cease or change that activity altogether. It's probably not a good idea. I've used this picture a lot of swimming with the sharks. So if there's things that we can stop doing right now, we're going to do that. We're going to try to avoid getting within 6 feet of people, but we still have to do our work. So at some point, we have to accept some of the risk. You can transfer the risk to another part of the organization or a third party. You can use financing or insurance. It's probably too late to get insurance to handle this if you don't already have it. And of course, you can try to control or mitigate by reducing the risk. In this case, it's a silly picture of a mouse with a helmet on trying to get that cheese. And if it's possible to remove risk to the activity, of course, this is something you should do. We talked about controls when we were looking at identifying risk and what kind of controls do we already have in place. So we need to next look at what kinds of controls do we need to add. And it might include, updating your policies, putting different procedures in place. But understanding, again, your risk management strategy is going to be a balance between what controls you put in place and your appetite for risk. I did do a little modification to this figure, looking at the effectiveness of controls. We've always used this figure, or at least for the last 5 or 6 years. So it looks at the top being most effective. If you can eliminate a risk, great. Down to the least effective. So when we talk about eliminating, we're talking about physically removing the threat or the hazard. Well, we can't eliminate COVID-19 right now, so that's not an option for us. We're looking at substitute. You can replace the hazard. Well, in this case, we're all kind of waiting for this vaccination that might occur someday. So this is a way to actually try to eliminate it. We won't eliminate it, but people that are vaccinated hopefully won't get sick from it. We can engineer controls. Right now what we're doing is, this is actually the definition, is to isolate people from the hazard. We're using social distancing for that. You also have administrative controls, which is changing the way people work. We're seeing that. And it should say remote work versus remote word. But, changing how, when we're talking even about schools reopening, schools need to reopen. Kids are not going to, learn from home for very long. So how do we teach our kids and teach our universities and continue the process of education, for example? It's going to mean some changes in how people work. And you can see once everybody returns to your normal work environment, that's going to look different as well, at least for the short term until we have a vaccination. And of course, we all know what a PPE is now. We don't even know. We don't even have to write it out, but this is protecting the worker with personal protective equipment, which is, of course, still an issue today for many of us in many countries. So this is another place where you can put together a chart that looks at how effective are our controls and our risk levels. So control effectiveness is on the left, from fully effective to totally ineffective, and then we've got the low, medium, high, and extreme. So if we were going to look at where we should improve, this would be, where we're totally to partially effective, and looking at your high and extreme levels of risk. Some of the ways that you can measure that would be of how much money is it going to cost you, what is it going to mean to you as far as life safety or safety outcomes, and what is it going to mean to you for brand. In the United States, we've seen a lot in the news about our meatpacking organizations. 3 companies have been highlighted. They've been closed for not providing adequate social distancing, for having adequate PPEs. And so not only has it had an impact to them for life safety because they have people sick and that have died in their organizations, but their brand is being impacted. And in the long term, I would imagine that there's going to be some lawsuits, but they need to remain open. So how can they do that safely? But the fact is that they remained open without putting in safety things that is ultimately impacting the company's financial aspects. It's impacted people's life safety, and it's definitely impacting their brand and reputation. So when you look at another way of putting this into a chart for looking at your potential exposure and control effectiveness, you take each risk and you say our level of risk is high for these things, our potential exposure is high, and our control effectiveness is low. So we're going to give that a priority 1 for treatment. The next one, priority 2, is when your level of risk is high, your potential exposure might be low, but your controls are also low. And then your third priority for treatment is going to be, it might have a low level of risk, but high potential exposure and low control effectiveness. So this might actually be more of the pandemic situation is, we didn't think it would happen. We don't really have any controls in place, but there's a high potential exposure. when we talk about doing risk descriptions, this looks kind of tedious, but it's really important to do this because your risk description is going to tie to your risk strategy. So here is where you name the risk and you name it in some manner. Maybe you put a number to it, whatever you're calling it. And then you look at the scope. What are the details of potential incidents, including size, type, and number? What about the nature? What's the time scale? If you're looking at hurricanes, for example, it's going to, there's certain months of the year, depending on what country you're in, where this, typhoons or hurricanes are going to impact you more. What are the expectations of our internal and external stakeholders? When you're looking at here's where you bring in your risk evaluation, that likelihood and magnitude and possible impact. Notice that they're all together. It's not just looking at impact. We're also looking at likelihood. What's our loss experience? What's happened to us in the past? What's our risk appetite or attitude or tolerance or target for control of this risk? What are our existing controls and risk treatments do we have in place, and what are some other ones that we could implement? What are some ways that we can improve on how we're doing this? And then this needs to be assigned, the assignment of this needs to be assigned to people who would be responsible for implementation. So this is what we're calling, a risk register also. So what you're looking at is what can happen and how can it happen? What are the consequences or impact of it happening? What's the likelihood? Again, what's our adequacy of current controls, our consequence or impact ratings, your likelihood rating, your level of risk, and your risk priority. And this is where your risk register takes that risk description and really consolidates all that information into one place, as well as what decisions have been made for mitigation. What is your risk management strategy for each particular risk? This is all really tied to risk reporting and communication, and it requires this to be an open two-way exchange of information. I would hope that during these last weeks that your organization has been communicating with you more than it has in the past. And this is something that takes time. When you have an incident, you need to have more communication. When you're working away from each other and you don't have the opportunity for casual conversation, you need to schedule that communication. So I would hope that you are being very, very open right now on what's working, what's not working, and how can we do things better. The Marsh has put out some really interesting articles, or they're calling them research, on how to reopen business in a post-coronavirus world. They have a lot of resources there. Also, McKinsey has been putting out some really decent material and looking at specific areas that you might find interesting. But what Marsh is saying here is that for the future, we cannot reopen until we have got our cleanliness things down. Looking at cleanliness is next to godliness. It's going to be required in the future. And how is your organization going to implement rigorous cleaning procedures? Your organization is going to need to define and distribute new cleanliness metrics and include inspections. Who's going to be responsible for that? These are potentially new jobs that your organization may have. They're going to need to start stockpiling PPEs when they become available. Looking at your actual building itself and your HVAC and air filtration. How can you make sure that you're getting clean air, that if somebody coughs or sneezes, that isn't being spread throughout your organization in its HVAC system? And this is something that food safety people are well aware of, is this hazard analysis of critical control points. This is really what they do in food companies, is they go through and they look at touch points. What are people touching? And doing an analysis of touch points helps them to understand where they need to clean. So we can take a lot of learning from this HACCP practice. I'm not sure if it's outside the U.S., but my assumption is you have something similar to that. It may be called something different. But it's really an analysis of touch points. And also determining what does healthy look like and who can work. Your company is going to have to implement regular testing and screening for symptoms. How do you do that? And here is where, depending on what country you live in, it may impact privacy and employment law issues. So how might these change for a company to be allowed to open? So I mentioned that my daughter needs to continue going to work, so they get their temperature taken. And then the question becomes, what do you do if they have a temperature? So they've been just sending people home. But what they're saying is that we need to have a strategy for what do you do when you identify people who have symptoms at work. What are you going to do if people get sick? What are your quarantine policies? I'm hoping you all have already put those into place. But the question really becomes time off. And so there are companies that I've heard that, if you don't show up, you will lose your job. So that puts everybody at risk. Then there's other companies that are saying, everybody gets paid. You're all staying home even if you're not doing your work. And that's going to depend on how much has your company prepared for something like this, and what kind of financial resource do they have, and how long can they sustain that. And this ties to mental health support. We saw that on the weekend in some states in our country, they lifted their quarantine, and lots of different kinds of personal care businesses were allowed to open. But we saw that two things happened. One is that a lot of businesses decided not to open because they felt at risk of having customers. And two, people didn't take advantage of those because they were afraid. So when you do reopen your company, will people come back to work? And what kinds of expectations are they going to have from you in order to come back to work? And again, this is going to be tied to what that work looks like. Your organization is going to be expected to monitor its people, and you might end up with a classification based on new health standards that need to be developed. So when you're looking at active monitoring of health and symptoms, I, as a business employer, have never, taken anyone's temperature in my office and told them what if they could or could not work. Is your organization going to need to be responsible for screening for viruses when that becomes available? Are you going to monitor people's temperatures? There's already companies that have put together, I'm not sure if they're ready to be purchased yet, but they are creating wristbands similar to, those exercise bands that people wear that allow access to where you've been, where you work, and commerce, which means that they're also measuring your temperature and where you've been so they can track if you have come in contact with somebody that might have the virus. And then looking at the fact that your company is now going to have to monitor people in a more individualized way. So think about all the things that you share at work. I think about several people that I know that work in laboratory settings that, we've gone to these where people don't have their own desktops anymore, and you're sharing workspaces where you're signing out. You have a locker for your things and you sign out a workspace. So how are we going to manage the sharing of computers, printers, PDAs, phones that are still sitting on a desk? How can we implement some non-touch control systems? We're talking about things like elevators and other things. Some companies already have that in place because they're using your own swipe cards to get you in the elevator and to the right floors. How might you use shift schedules, rotations, and start times? I do find it interesting that when my husband went to high school, his high school had too many students, and they actually taught school in shifts, and he happened to be on the 6 a.m. to 11 a.m. shift, and then he had a job in the afternoon, so they actually taught kids on shifts. However, they were crammed together closely. But it has been done before, so schools have done it. Companies are probably going to need to start doing that as well. And then we've already limited large employee meetings. How can we continue to do that effectively? And then looking at how we isolate people. So remote working is working for a lot of people, not everyone. But we do know that if it's been working and people like it, they're going to expect it in the future. And so looking at how does that change your new environment. Looking at travel modes and facilities, what's going to be considered acceptable for you to go to? What's your impact to commuting and carpooling and ride sharing? People still need to get to work. Especially if you're in a city, people don't even have cars. So how do you get back and forth to work, which is why we're seeing that, public transportation is still in place for most large cities, as long as we have people willing to transport us. But what about, planes? I've talked to people who are asking us about ICOR's education, and they want to take a class, but the rules are at their company, they have a new policy that for the next 12 months, they will not be able to go in person to any meetings outside of their company. So that means that we're going to see, air travel continuing to be impacted by that as well. So how are you going to make sure, what kinds of policies is your company going to put into place as far as the level of risk it's willing to accept for each individual person? And how much control can your company potentially have over what you do? I heard one large company telling its employees that if they, this was before the shelter and stay-at-home orders were put into place in the U.S., that if they took advantage of not being able to work by going skiing or going on a trip, that they would not be allowed back to work and that they would not be paid because they've now put at risk anybody that they might be in contact with at their company. So that gets into that whole idea of legal aspects for this as well. And lastly, the topic that's probably at most of our hearts, the company is going to need to be prepared, finally. All of you that have been talking about we need to get top management attention, I believe you've got top management's attention. So you need to be ready for that. And so, everybody needs to have that planning and training and practicing, including the people in your supply chains, to make sure that you can continue to operate in whatever level that you're trying to operate at in whatever manner for a long time. So this is going to require updated policies and practices. Your IT systems are going to continue to need to be operated. That's what I was saying. I know people in the IT business that are working overtime every single day because their clients are requiring them to provide more robust services. Your companies are going to be expected to stockpile PPEs and other essentials if and when they become available. And there's going to be clear behavioral expectations on what being prepared looks like, and reviewing that and creating that continual improvement feedback loop. So what I'd like you to do in the post-webinar survey, if you could please share anything that you would like, because I know we weren't able to do some of the polls, but what we're really trying to do is to have a better understanding of what strategies your organization has already implemented or the things that they have in place to implement soon. And we would like to be able to share that, and we'll take everybody's names and company names out of that. But just for people to be able to learn from each other during this time, it's really, really important. We've lost our ability to go to conferences and to network, and we need to continue to learn from what other people are doing so that you can learn from them as well. In conclusion, of course, risk should be managed at the enterprise or organization-wide level. It's a responsibility of top management. It should be a process that methodically addresses the identification and treatment of risks that may harm the organization's operating efficiency. It should be integrated into the culture of the organization by assigning responsibility to each member of the organization. And risk impact, probability, adequacy of controls, and risk appetite should inform an organization's risk strategy. We obviously have classes that can teach you more about this. We'd, of course, love to tell you more about that. And our next webinar is going to be about ISO 22301, Insights from a Third-Party Auditor. We are also partnering with a certification body we're going to be putting some webinars on with them about how they're actually doing interviews with some of the companies that are certified to ISO 22301 and finding out how their strategies are working and what things they've had to do. The June 10th Hurricanes, Hackers, and Hashtags, I'm sure will be much more pandemic focused on the communications aspect of that too. So we welcome you to sign up for these. I just wanted to remind you that the May webinar date was changed from May 20th to May 27th because the auditor needed to do an audit because they had to cancel a live audit, and they're rescheduled it as a remote audit. So that was changed by a week. Jara, are you able to see questions, or would you like me to see if there's any new questions?
Yeah, I can see questions now. No new questions, comments. Don't forget people and their risk perception. And some folks thanking us for your presentation. Yeah.
All right. So I know people didn't get to see all the slides, and so this might be one, Jara, that I might just make the slides available. Normally we don't, but if the actual recording didn't show the slides, because it was showing just the polls. Let's go ahead and we can make this one available for people as well. And that way you can get the links that are here. So thank you very much for attending. We'll have the actual PowerPoint available to you on the same webinar page that we always have. Thank you for attending. Good luck to every one of you, and we would love to hear from you so that we can continue to learn and share learnings across the globe.